After years of waiting for an Elden Ring DLC, by the time I finally entered the Realm of Shadow, I was completely prepared to fight for Miquella with everything I had. He was the god I chose. I don't know about you all, but given my experience with other Fromsoftware DLCs, I was sort of under the impression that Shadow of the Erdtree would give us an opportunity for a new ending. An ending where Miquella ascended to godhood and we were his Elden Lord. I should have known better than to think that Fromsoftware would give me what I expected. But given the context of what did happen, I'm left with the question, are we truly the hero of the DLC? Or are we preventing the best possible outcome for the lands between? Are the other possible outcomes better, worse? And is there any moral validity to what Miquella is attempting to do, or has he just become a self-righteous lunatic? These are the questions I want to attempt to answer in this video. I was a little surprised after the release of the DLC how quickly the community turned on Miquella. Not that I think that's wrong, far from it. His methods for achieving power were morally ambiguous at best, and in a lot of ways, quite evil. However, the established lore of Miquella in the base game paints a picture of someone who's kind and full of pity for the suffering of those around him. Yet there certainly were hints in the base game of a more nefarious character. And this is, of course, in perfect Fromsoftware fashion. I would imagine the developer wanted there to be nuance. Obviously, mind control is bad, and I think Sir Ansbach is a perfect illustration of this, more so than the other characters in the DLC, because we're shown how deeply it affected him in a personal way. Mohg clearly wasn't that bad, or at least not as bad as we thought, yet he's Miquella the Kind, and he speaks to us about bringing about an age of compassion. Saint Trina doesn't plea with us to stop Miquella because he's evil. She pleads with us out of love for him, telling us that godhood would be his prison. So for these reasons and others, I wanted to take a closer look at this nuance and attempt to determine the ins and outs of Miquella's goals, what his age of compassion may have looked like, and how that stacks up to some of the other endings we can bring about in the base game. So I made a video a few months back dealing with the Vow, and given how long it's been since the DLC's release, I would imagine that most of you already have a good understanding of what this Vow is, and a personal headcanon on what the Vow specifically entailed. In this chapter, I more explicitly want to cover the moral implications of this Vow, and what it says about either character's intentions. For completion's sake, I'll briefly cover. We know of the existence of a vow between Radahn and Miquella for a number of reasons. The Young Lion's armor reads, "When Melania, blade of Miquella, let the wrought flower blossom in Aeonia, Radahn heard a murmur in his ear. Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort." Dialogue from Redmane Freya, quote, "Kindly Miquella spoke of the vow he once made with General Radahn, and it is here the vow shall be honored." End quote. And of course, the obvious. Quote, "Lord brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place." End quote. The last bit of this dialogue clearly displaying that there were two parts to this vow. Radahn's part being that he would play the role of consort upon Miquella's ascension, and Miquella's part remaining unknown. And the question of what Miquella's part of the vow was has remained a point of debate in the community since the DLC's release. So a question that needs answering here, was Radahn compelled by Miquella, like many of the NPCs throughout the DLC? If we had a concrete answer to this, the question of Miquella's morality would be a little less nuanced. When we approach the Shadow Keep, the message appears, somewhere a great rune has broken. And upon returning to speak with the NPCs scattered throughout the Land of Shadow, we learn that they were almost all compelled by Miquella. When speaking with them after this point, we witness the characters for who they really are, their individual goals, ambitions, and motives before being compelled by Miquella. However, it's clear that upon the shattering of this great rune, Miquella has not completely lost the ability to compel others. We know this because during the final boss fight we can be compelled. He has to grab us twice to do so, which could imply his power has been lessened, but could also just be a game mechanic. So, consider that Perhaps Miquella did state both sides of the vow during his cutscene. Again, quote, "Lord brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place." The remembrance of a god and a lord states, "In their childhood, Miquella saw in Radahn a lord, his strength and his kindness that stood in stark contrast with their afflicted selves. And so Miquella made his heartfelt wish that Radahn would one day be his king consort." Much can be inferred from this item description, but what I'm looking at here is "in their childhood" and "heartfelt wish." I believe this clearly implies that Miquella made the vow in his childhood. Now obviously Miquella is eternally youthful, but you know what I mean. And Miquella vowed to, quote, "make the world a gentler place." And perhaps it's really that simple. Perhaps this is the vow. We know that Miquella suffers from a curse of eternal youth, of nascency. The nascent butterfly item description reads, "This butterfly appears as if it's just emerged from its cocoon for its entire life." And the word nascent means coming or having recently come into existence, beginning to develop. Now, the nascent butterfly being tied to Miquella is obvious enough. But my point is simply that we know Miquella was a child, an actual child, when he made this vow to Radahn. It doesn't mean he wasn't kindly and with the allure of a god, as Malenia says, but he was still very young. And I imagine Radahn lordly, brave, strong, and kind, speaking with his little brother about his goals for the future, his ambitions. Miquella speaking about how he wants to make the world a gentler place full of love and compassion, and promising Radahn that if he plays the role of consort that he can do this. And Radahn, being the kindly older brother, taking this as the musings of a naive child. It might seem a bit simple, but to me, nothing else fits quite as well with the base game lore along with the DLC lore as this theory. Miquella being stuck in a state of unchanging nascency would require that these musings to him never evolved. You might say he never grew out of them. And while Radahn perhaps just saw Miquella as his sweet little brother who wanted everyone to love each other and be nice to each other, Radahn also knew the world for what it was. Even by this point in time, Radahn would have been a seasoned warrior, as stated in the remembrance of a god and a lord, strong and lordly, without unrealistic notions of a world filled with love and compassion. Yet Miquella, unable to move on or grow past these notions in his nascent state eternally, he never let this go. And what Miquella viewed in his mind as a concrete vow, Radahn viewed simply as the musings of a child. Not so much that Radahn forsook the vow, but more that he never viewed it as such. His little brother wanted to save the world, and Radahn, with love for his little brother, of course, you and I will save the world together. It's because of this I wonder if Radahn even knew what was going on when Malenia arrived in Caelid. Again, from the young lion's armor description, Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort. Part of me thinks that he had no idea what Malenia was talking about when she said this, that so much time had passed and his ambitions were so far from whatever Miquella was doing that he never even viewed that conversation he had with Miquella as a vow at all. But this is just more speculative. I just find it sort of humorous to imagine Malenia showing up in Caelid and Radahn having no clue what she's doing there. There's other evidence that implies Radahn was not aligned with Miquella. First of all, there's practically no lore that ties these characters together in the base game. I say practically because you have things like the thrones in front of the Erdtree during the cutscene with Morgott, and the fact that both acquired great runes after the Shattering. You've also got evidence of Radahn invading Leyndell, given the art sequence at the beginning of the game showing Morgott fighting Radahn. However, this could also have been Radahn attempting to take Stormveil Castle, given that we first encounter Margit at Stormveil. If you fall into the camp of those who believe that Radahn was fighting for Miquella the whole time, you could argue that Radahn was attempting to take Leyndell or Stormveil in an attempt to prop Miquella up as the next god. However, I find this unlikely given that Malenia is sent to Caelid, seemingly, to retrieve Radahn. In an interview with IGN, Miyazaki discusses the effect that the Great Runes had on the Shardbearers, describing how the Great Runes twisted and warped the Shardbearers and how they each fell to madness and ruin in their own ways. This is sort of outside the scope of this video, but I wanted to bring it up as evidence that Radahn's motives not only seemed very disconnected from Miquella's, but he likely has his own larger ambitions that were bolstered by his Great Rune. Ratatosker has a great video called General Radahn's Heroic Concept, which talks about Radahn's goals, and it's a great short video if you're looking to better understand what Radahn was trying to accomplish throughout the Shattering War. But returning to the scope of this video, when we see Radahn in the Lands of Shadow, he is far more noble in his appearance, less large and monstrous, less fell. And throughout the base game, we get all this lore implying that Radahn was very intelligent, studying sorcery, very powerful, and independent in his ambitions. The Starscourge heirloom reads, "The mightiest hero of the demigods confronted the falling stars alone, and thus did he crush them, his conquest stealing the very fate of the stars." The Remembrance of the Starscourge reads, "The Red Lion General wielded gravitational powers which he learned in Celia during his younger days. Also, he would never have to abandon his beloved scrawny steed." And the eccentric hood reads, "Jaren served General Radahn as a guest commander, and they are said to have sworn an oath of honorable death to one another." Smart, kind, and commanding. Yet when we see him at the Gate of Divinity, he seems almost robotic. He still doesn't speak, one of the most lore-heavy characters in the game, and he still doesn't say a word. Maybe it's just a feeling, but it seems like he's being controlled. When I first completed the DLC, I was in the minority, it seemed, of those who believed that Radahn was in his right mind, that he was fighting for Miquella of his own will. But as I've examined more of the lore and what we know of this character simply from the base game, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't seem that he's acting himself. The Secret Rite scroll reads, "The Lord will usher in a god's return, and the Lord's soul will require a vessel." What Miquella did to Mohg to achieve this end doesn't exactly paint Miquella the Kind in a benevolent light. It also doesn't seem like the way General Radahn would wish to conquer another, through trickery. And with everything covered previously, I don't believe that Radahn was supporting Miquella's claim to godhood of his own volition, that he likely fell victim to Miquella's compelling nature. We don't get a concrete Miquella ending. We never exactly get to see what Miquella's age of compassion would have looked like. We thwart his plans just as he is coming into his godhood. That being said, we don't exactly get to see what any of the true endings would have looked like either. There's lore with every ending, implying what would occur should we choose the Age of the Duskborn or the Age of Fracture and so on. But it's not like we get to experience the world as it would have been. Of the base game endings, the one to me that comes with the most ambiguity is Ranni's ending. It has the most lore, the longest quest, yet still seems to come with the most questions. I do feel that I have a decent understanding of what's going on in her ending, and there are those like me who make these videos who claim to have a complete understanding of her ending, yet even in one of my more recent videos when I claim that during Ranni's ending the Elden Ring seems to fade away, I had a comment claiming that it's not fading away but it's being absorbed into the Dark Moon. I'm not sure I buy this theory, but it doesn't mean it's not the case. The point is, I do think there's still plenty of room to speculate in terms of Ranni's ending. However, one thing we know for sure is that she's leaving. She departs from the lands between. Many of you probably know this, but if you speak to Miniature Ranni at her chamber's site of grace after finishing her questline, she gives you an outline of what exactly she intends to do with her order. Quote, "Mine will be an order not of gold, but the stars and the moon of the chill night. I would keep them far from the earth beneath our feet. As it is now, life and souls and order are bound tightly together. But I would have them at great remove, and have the certainties of sight, emotion, faith, and touch all become impossibilities, which is why I would abandon the soil with mine order." End quote. Given other applicable lore discoveries in the base game, this aspect of her order, the fact that she's leaving, seems to be a good thing. The Mending Rune of Perfect Order that you receive upon completing Gold Mask Quest reads, "The current imperfection of the Golden Order, or instability of ideology, can be blamed upon the fickleness of the gods, no better than men. That is the fly in the ointment." This rune implies that the Golden Order would be perfect if it wasn't for the gods. They are the problem. Their existence in the world and the things they do are the problem. And even though the Golden Order and Ranni's order would not be the same thing, the act of her leaving the lands between seems to be a step in the right direction. But why am I talking about Ranni's ending at all? I think you can draw some interesting comparisons between Miquella and Ranni and the ways they went about achieving their goals, or rather some contrasts. For example, much of what Ranni does is openly nefarious. I mean, she kept her deeds largely hidden, but those deeds were not veiled in benevolence. They were openly pretty evil. She used a shard of the Rune of Death to plan and carry out an assassination of Godwyn the Golden, which also set in motion a plague of undeath in the form of Deathroot across the lands between. And whether the Deathroot was part of her plan or not, that's a pretty big problem. This plague of undeath also created an entire class of persecuted peoples in the lands between, who have their own ending in the form of the Age of the Duskborn. After the Black Knife assassins carried out the deed, she left them high and dry, likely imprisoning their leader in an Everjail on the Moonlit Plateau, and leaving the rest to fend for themselves and scatter across the lands between. There's plenty of other lore implying that she hung them all out to dry, and if you're interested in that, watch this video here, or this video by Smotown, which goes far more in depth on this subject. I have plenty of other lore theories on some of the things I believe Ranni may have done that were less than admirable to achieve her goals, but I'm not going to get into them here. But of the things we know she did, the choices we know she made, quite nefarious. Yet Miquella, on the other hand, is openly, on the surface, kind and benevolent. His base game lore strongly implies a kind and gentle heart. With the actions he took to save his sister, his turning away from the Golden Order and creating a safe haven for the persecuted, those that were left behind by the current order. Loved by all, with the only real evidence of a more nefarious purpose in the base game being the Bewitching Branch. However, we reach the Lands of Shadow and we begin to see the truth of Miquella's methods. Upon the shattering of his great rune, we learn just how big of a sway Miquella had on these particular followers of his. Ansbach is easily the best example of this. Upon the shattering of Miquella's great rune, quote, "The fog that vexed my aging faculties has been lifted, and follies better left forgotten haunt me once again. In an attempt to free Lord Mohg from his enchantment, I challenged tender Miquella only to have my own heart rather artfully stolen. I believed that with sufficient mastery, even an Empyrean would be within reach of my blade. I could not have been more mistaken. Miquella the Kind is a monster. Pure and radiant, he wields love to shrive clean the hearts of men. There is nothing more terrifying." End quote. Later on, after giving him the secret right scroll, quote, "As if using Lord Mohg to gain entrance to the Lands of Shadow were not enough, he plans to use his corpse as the vessel of his king consort. He has forsaken Lord Mohg's soul. He desires only his empty shell. I'm afraid tender Miquella fails to grasp the humiliation implied by this act. One thing is certain, my dear lord deserved better." End quote. I say that Sir Ansbach is the best example of just how strong and overpowering Miquella's enchantment is because of what we learn from him after the shattering of Miquella's great rune. Ansbach is one that never would have followed Miquella, and he's a man of honor who, in the end, seeks only to avenge his fallen lord. and the way he speaks about what Miquella is doing, his means of achieving his goals, paints a very grim picture. Redmane Freya's revelations are interesting and telling as well. When speaking to Ansbach about her, he says, quote, "She must be feeling the need to reaffirm her allegiance before she heads to war," end quote. Freya herself says, quote, "If you happen to see Lady Letta, tell her that I'm striking out on my own. Don't worry, I've no mind to cross any of you. The guidance of kind Miquella remains etched in my very flesh. It's only, there's something that I must know. Kindly Miquella spoke of the vow he once made with General Radahn, and it is here the vow shall be honored. I must know the nature of the vow," end quote. Freya remains loyal to Miquella in the end, but we see that she clearly had some things to work out that would have been left aside if not for the shattering of Miquella's great rune. And of course, Needle Knight Letta, who is straight up ready to go on a killing spree after Miquella's rune is shattered. Anyone who she's not absolutely certain is loyal to Miquella, which says a lot about her character. But also it can't be ignored that while under Miquella's sway, she was at least stopped from having these thoughts that are not so kind. When considering the intent of the developer, I think what Fromsoftware is trying to show us by having nearly every NPC affected by the shattering of the rune, save a few, including Egon, RIP, is that Miquella didn't sway one or two people. He did it to many to achieve his goals. Nefarious, but not openly. Not near as openly as Ranni. I suppose the point I'm getting at when comparing these two Empyreans is I'm trying to compare the means with the ends. Ranni accomplished a lot of evil things in attempts to achieve her end, but when it all came down to it, she becomes a god and departs the lands between. When taking the Mending Rune of Perfect Order's item description into account, this seems a noble end. As far as we know, the Death Root is still there, so that's pretty bad. But the gods will no longer exist within the lands between to trouble it with their ambitions which harm the individuals of the land, leaving the people to seek individual freedom apart from the needs and desires of the gods and demigods. It looks dirty, but to me seems right. While on the other hand you have Miquella, who looks fair and kind and compassionate, but it feels dirty. The more we uncover about Miquella's means, the less likely the ends seem. While this video is attempting to determine whether Miquella's Age of Compassion was moral or immoral, whether the lands between would have been better served if the player character allowed Miquella to succeed, the means of achieving this age, much like Ranni's, were clearly immoral. But unlike Ranni's, the end result doesn't seem noble at all. He puts his lord's soul into the dead body of another lord, and we can't know whether or not the world would have been filled with mind-controlled followers who knew nothing different. But this has to be at least considered as a likely possibility given just how many we know to have been swayed by him, and the likelihood of many, many more given the existence of the Bewitching branch in the base game. I interpret Ranni's ending as the Elden Ring fading away before she departs the lands between. I've begun to question this belief, as I stated earlier, based on some comments I received, but I still believe that seems to be the likely case. And with the addition of Miquella's circlet in the DLC, I speculate that Miquella's age would have likely removed the Elden Ring as well. The Circlet of Light reads, "The circlet of light which adorned Miquella's head as he returned in divine aspect. It has begun to fade into nothingness. This circle was to be the very foundation upon which Miquella's Age of Compassion would be built, should it have ever come to pass." I interpret the phrase, "the very foundation," as a replacement for the Elden Ring. If you don't think this is the case, please explain in the comments below. I'm still unable to exactly grasp what the lands would look like without the existence of the Elden Ring. Would the world cease to exist? Change? I don't know. But it does seem to me that Miquella's order would remain grounded within the lands between, likely leading to some of the same issues outlined within the Mending Rune of Perfect Order's item description. The fickleness of the gods is the problem. When attempting to determine the morality of Miquella's Age of Compassion, his deeds outlined in the base game cannot be ignored. Was he always compelling others to do his will, or did this come later? Did he begin as a truly kind and benevolent Empyrean, or were his goals and ambitions always the same? To briefly cover the Erdtree first, if a deed is done with less than moral intent, yet the deed leads to good, is it still a good deed? In my last video, I go pretty in depth on what I believe the true purpose of the Erdtree was. I'm not going to cover it here, but in short, I do believe the purpose of the Erdtree goes beyond creating a land for the Albinarchs, Misbegotten, and others that fall outside the current order, more than just a new tree for a new age. Yet, the Erdtree is there. Erdtree Town, Elfell, the husk of the tree, and people reside there. There are Albinarchs in the consecrated snowfields seemingly protecting the Erdtree from those that would approach. Misbegotten in Erdtree Town, knights in Elfell who await their lord's return. Now, the Erdtree did fail. The Erdtree crest great shield reads, "Carried by knights who have vowed to serve Miquella's Erdtree, yet now with the Erdtree misshapen, this wondrous rendition is a fleeting fantasy." In the Erdtree Knight armor reads, "The Erdtree ultimately failed to grow into an Erdtree." The Erdtree is a rotten husk, and while the death of the tree is likely due to Miquella's abandoning it and failing to water it with his own blood, the rotting of the tree is sadly due to his own sister. My point in mentioning the failure of the Erdtree is simply that who knows how long the Erdtree would have served as a safe haven before the rotting affliction affected the rest of the inhabitants, as it clearly has already began to do. Yet, there it stands, even in its current state, a safe haven for those who would be persecuted by the Golden Order. They at least had a place to abide, if they could discover the path. What Miquella was able to do for his sister also paints a fairly well-intended, kind picture. Radagon's Rings of Light reads, "A gift of gratitude to the young Miquella from his father, Radagon." And yet the young Miquella abandoned fundamentalism, for it could do nothing to treat Malenia's accursed rot. This was the beginning of unalloyed gold. Every piece of Malenia's armor points out that it is made of unalloyed gold. And Miquella's needle reads, "One of the unalloyed gold needles that Miquella crafted to ward away the meddling of outer gods." The item description for the unalloyed gold needle before it becomes Miquella's needle states that it is thought capable of forestalling the incurable rotting sickness. So Miquella went to great lengths to cure or at least forestall his sister's affliction. This goal was the very thing that led to Miquella being synonymous with unalloyed gold. Now his knights and even his foot soldiers wear armor and bear arms that are adorned with unalloyed gold, stated in the item descriptions for armor sets found at the Erdtree. It's difficult not to wonder, especially with the release of the DLC and many of the revelations we get when it comes to Miquella, that perhaps Miquella kept his sister alive for the wrong reasons, that perhaps he simply needed her to use her as his blade while he sought to achieve his goals. Malenia's armor reads, "My brother will keep his promise. He possesses the wisdom, the allure of a god. He is the most fearsome Empyrean of all." We don't know what this promise was, but I think it's safe to assume it involves Miquella returning to the Erdtree. The Erdtree soldier ashes read, "When weakened, they explode to deliver a last-ditch attack." This was the bitter revelation discovered by the desperate soldiers who awaited the return of their lord to the rotted Erdtree. So, to speculate, I assume the plan was for Malenia to travel to Caelid and kill Radahn. Miquella would enter the realm of shadow with Mohg's body, and with Radahn dead, use Mohg's body as the vessel for Radahn to return, as stated in the Secret Rite scroll. Become a god and return to the Erdtree. And with his newfound godhood, perhaps he could cure his sister's rotting affliction, bring the Erdtree back, and everything would be well. Yet it seems he sort of hung her out to dry when things didn't go to plan. I mean, obviously the plan went awry when Radahn in fact did not die. And who knows how long it was that Radahn wandered the dunes in his maddened state. But all that time Malenia slept, and the Erdtree became more and more rotten. Not to mention, Mohg is still alive until we arrive as well. Perhaps Malenia was supposed to get to Mohg next after dealing with Radahn. But again, this is all just speculation, all to say that it seems Malenia was left high and dry when Miquella went to the Realm of Shadow. However, it is possible that he didn't know. It's also possible that once he was there, he was unable to leave. But again, if a deed is done with less than moral intent, yet the deed leads to good, is it still a good deed? Now obviously intent matters, yet through all of this, Malenia was saved, or at the least marginally spared from her rotting affliction due to the efforts of her brother and his unalloyed gold. It should also be at least mentioned that Miquella is shooting for an age of compassion. Quote, 1,000-year voyage guided by compassion, end quote. Unless he's straight up lying, this is the goal. That doesn't mean that it would have been the outcome, but I do believe it is the goal. Harkening back to the Mending Rune of Perfect Order, quote, the current imperfection of the Golden Order or instability of ideology can be blamed upon the fickleness of the gods no better than men. The gods are the problem. I do think Miquella's nascency goes directly against the idea of him being fickle, that he's more stuck rather than uncertain. I'm just attempting to illustrate that Miquella could have been the entire problem in and of himself. Perhaps he fails to see the implication of a world full of compelled peoples, that this, to him, isn't a world of slaves to his will and ideals at least, that he believes it to be a mercy. After giving Sir Ansbach the secret right scroll and speaking about Miquella's plans to use Mohg's body as a husk for Radahn's return, he states the following: I'm afraid tender Miquella fails to grasp the humiliation implied by this act. Another and much more outright example of Miquella being completely unaware of just how dishonorable and cruel this act would be, yet he does it anyways, and then yaps to us about his age of compassion. It's naive, almost childish. But again, in regards to Miquella's age of compassion not being what he seems to believe it would be, I believe that St. Trina's placement in the DLC is the developer's way of showing us just that. The ghost NPC in the stone coffin fissure at the Fisher Cross site of Grace says the following: Kindly Miquella, I see you've thrown away something you should not have, under any circumstances. How will you salvation offer to those who cannot be saved when you could not even save your other self? And the carved words on the cross at this site of Grace read, I abandon here my love. When we reach St. Trina, she tells us to slay Miquella, not out of wrath, but out of pity. Quote, make Miquella stop. Don't turn the poor thing into a god. Godhood would be Miquella's prison. A caged divinity is beyond saving. You must kill Miquella, grant him forgiveness, end quote. So what does a loveless god look like? In a video by Zuli the Witch titled Miquella's Greatest Mistake, it is theorized that perhaps to Miquella, love may have seemed a form of discrimination, keeping him from embracing all things equally, and given that St. Trina was the embodiment of Miquella's love, he cast her aside. And again, St. Trina seems to pity Miquella, not scold him. Don't turn the poor thing into a god. I think there's plenty of lore regarding Queen Marika to suggest that godhood is not all it's cracked up to be. It seems like St. Trina knows this. It also seems that St. Trina knows that Miquella's so-called age of compassion would not be the age Miquella believes it would be, and we are shown through dialogue in the stone coffin fissure that Miquella has made a grave mistake, that he perhaps may no longer achieve what he set out to achieve, given the circumstances surrounding the path that he chose. In our battle with Miquella, we are referred to as Lord of the Old Order, and in the opening dialogue of the fight, we are referred to as Aspiring Lord of the Old Order. I at first believed this to mean that in canon we are Elden Lord. Given the use of aspiring, I now theorize that this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We need at least 2 great runes to enter the Realm of Shadow, Radahn's and Mohg's, and by acquiring 2 great runes we are permitted to enter the capital Leyendell and seek the Elden Throne. Therefore, it makes sense that, at the least, Miquella sees us as one who either has claimed lordship or is in the process of doing so. I believe this is the intent of the developer here, that at the point we fight Miquella, we are fighting to preserve the old order. As I stated earlier, I think considering developers' intent is really important when trying to dissect the lore of these games. And I don't mean to sound pretentious, I obviously don't know the mind of Miyazaki and his team, but when looking at a point of lore, trying to determine the perspective of that lore. Is it narrator, just information, the perspective of another character, a character with good intentions, bad, or one who was perhaps led astray? Hunter D is a good example of this. He is one of the earliest introductions to the beliefs and teachings of the Golden Order, showing us not only the plague of undeath, but how ruthless the Golden Order can be when dealing with those things that lie outside the current order. Also showing us that the Golden Order may not be the good guys. This doesn't take much effort to determine, but this is a very early example of this. And then we get characters like Fia and Rajier, showing us that there may be another way, that the undead are not at fault for their condition, and there may be another more compassionate way. Not necessarily a better way, but just a different perspective on the issue. Now obviously, later on we learn that there's a lot more going on with Hunter D than we originally see, but hopefully you see my point. It seems the intention of the developer in the case of Miquella was to give us an idea of what and who Miquella was in the base game. Kind. Mysterious, with subtle hints suggesting otherwise. With the release of Shadow of the Erdtree, we are meant to see the other side to him, and the means by which he acquired all of these followers. I'm reluctant to say his true colors because I believe there's sufficient evidence showing his kindly nature and good intentions, at least in some regards, suggesting what may have started as well-intended ended with him compelling others into doing his dirty work. And when looking at what he did to Mohg, it is just that, dirty work. And we are, or at the least aspiring to be, Lord of the Old Order. We are fighting to preserve the way things are, or even the ending we choose. I don't necessarily think there is a canon ending. His dialogue still fits regardless of the ending we choose, save Frenzy Flame and possibly Ranni's ending, given that we seem to depart with her when she leaves the Lands Between. But seeing as he says Old Order, the Age of Fracture fits the best, and really simply just seeking the Elden Ring as well. There are a few endings that I think Miquella's age may have been better than. Surely the Dung Eater's ending, the Age of Despair, or even the Frenzy Flame. But now saying that out loud, I'm actually not exactly sure. The Lands Between being burned away might be better than a land of compelled slaves. But again, that's only if that's exactly what it would have been. But this is all very besides the point. We are fighting to preserve the order we choose, the quote, Old Order, and to thwart Miquella's so-called Age of Compassion. I don't think it's a stretch to say we're not necessarily the good guy in the base game. We're not the bad guy either. Like most Fromsoftware characters and stories, it's more nuanced than that. We're just the guy. We're the Tarnished who decided to do something about it. This likely isn't the satisfying answer that some of you were hoping for, but I don't think we're saving the world when we kill Miquella and Radahn, but I also don't think we're preventing the best possible outcome either. We can assume through evidence that Miquella's Age of Compassion likely wouldn't have been all it's cracked up to be given what was established previously in the video. Abandonment of St. Trina, nefarious means to achieving his goals such as mind control, the death of Mohg and use of his corpse, revival of Radahn, and so on. With the knowledge of how Miquella sought his ascension to godhood, we are able to clearly see that he's not the benevolent, kind being he was made out to be in the base game, even if he believes himself to be. This is what I think the intent of the developer is with Miquella, to show us, like many characters and concepts within this game, Miquella is not everything he seems to be. Again, not all he's cracked up to be. Flawed, lacking the perspective of those less mighty than he is, seemingly unable to see his own faults. The Cerulean Coast Cross reads, I abandon here my doubt and vacillation. The Spiral Rise Cross reads, I abandon here all of my fears. Perhaps he did have misgivings. That seems quite clear given I abandoned my doubts, but not anymore. Yet we cannot deny that much of what Miquella did in his life was kind, and at the least well-meaning at times. And while I think he remained well-intended even in the end, St. Trina shows us the other side of things. Even though Miquella seeks to establish an age of compassion, it likely would not have been that. It would have been a prison for him, and he would not have had the means to maintain or support an age of compassion without the use of his compelling abilities, which in turn leads to a world of slaves. But it should also be considered that those who were compelled by Miquella, the various NPCs throughout the DLC, these NPCs were content. Unwillfully content by means of Miquella's charm, but content nonetheless. And given the circumstances surrounding some of the other endings, it may not have been the worst world to live in. I'm new to these types of videos, so please leave your comments below. Much of this video is speculative in nature, so again, your comments are much appreciated. If you liked the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. And if you enjoy this type of content, consider becoming a member. Thanks for watching.